Okay, so we have a number of questions that we try and work through. Having said that, if there's anything that you would like to add, change, develop, then you feel free to do so. Okay.
Sure thing.
Okay, so can we start out with some basic information? So your name, your date of birth, and your place of birth, please.
Okay, John J. Hurt, H-U-R-T, date of birth March 27, 1938, place of birth Nashville, Tennessee, USA.
Okay, John, could you tell us a little bit about you, your upbringing, where you're from, that sort of thing?
Well, I was born in the South, obviously. I grew up mostly in Atlanta, Georgia. I went to college at a school south of Atlanta, Mercer University in Macon. I went from there to graduate school in French history at the University of North Carolina, where the attraction, in addition to the institution itself, was the presence of George Taylor, formerly quite well known in French Revolution studies. I took a master's there, served 2 years in the Army, where happily I was sent to France, which was no sacrifice for me. Served outside La Rochelle. Came back in 1964, resumed my doctoral studies at North Carolina. Then had a Fulbright scholarship back to France, where I was affiliated with the University of Rennes, but essentially researching my dissertation. That would have been in 1966 to 1968. And there I was in Rennes when the uprising or the événement broke out in May of 1968, finishing my doctoral research.
Okay, great stuff. So you find yourself in France in 1968, having had some experience of France beforehand?
Yes. Could you maybe get a little closer to the microphone? I'm just barely getting your voice. I don't know how to turn up the volume here.
Can you hear me? Is it okay? Can you hear me now?
Oh, it's well enough.
Okay, no problem. So you've been to France before. You've been in France for some time before the kick off. Did you have any experience with political or social activism prior to 1968?
No, I couldn't say so. In the Army, of course, that kind of thing didn't come into your job description. And in Rennes, there was just the normal low-level announcements of this or that political meeting. And I never felt any interest in attending. So the May '68 thing, as far as I was concerned, just came out of was a surprise.
That was going to be my next question. So did you not feel anything coming in terms of the atmosphere, how you were experiencing the university?
I would have to say no. Now, we were aware, I was married then, we were aware, my wife and I, that some social conditions in Rennes were a bit shockingly low standards for lower middle class people. The people you saw in butcher shops and that kind of thing were obviously suffering from low wages. And in retrospect, I suppose that could have been a warning, but that had also been true back in '63, '64. We could talk about strikes pre-1968 when you get to that point. But no, I'd have to say no. Like people in the French Revolution, I had no sense that anything was about to blow up.
Okay. As someone from outside of France, were you aware that at that time there was maybe a lot of change being experienced internationally, socially, even politically, in terms of the Vietnam conflict and so on and so forth?
Oh, well, yes. When you get to the Vietnam conflict, that's a different matter altogether. There was a good deal of consciousness in Rennes, and I believe, and I'm sure among the students, of the reality of the Vietnam conflict, which was covered on television for those who had access to television. And of course, President de Gaulle made frequent statements in opposition to the war, and he held nothing back. I guess he got to the point, as you may well know, that he said he'd stopped talking about America and Vietnam because he had nothing left to say. He had said it all. So yes, there was, in fact, now that you jog my memory, I have to revise my earlier statement in the the fall of 1967, there was a big demonstration in Rennes, which I believe was directed at the Vietnam War. And there was quite a large meeting that paraded through the streets in the evening. There was a Franco-American Institute down on the main street along the quay, which gave free English lessons for those French who were interested. It was financed at that time by the U.S. government. And there was some concern that the Institute would be, damaged, and people were coming in and out of it, activists kind of checking it out. People who didn't belong there wouldn't normally come in to use the library or inquire about free lessons. So yes, there was some activism on the left side of things, but nothing to suggest a general strike or anything anti-American would have been predictable. But something else, not from where I sat.
And what about sort of cultural change? This is the era of an important cultural change internationally, but also in France as well, whether that's through music, fashion, sort of.
I didn't hear exactly what you said. Did you say control what now?
Cultural change. Was there any sense that things were changing on the cultural level, whether that's through music or clothes or sort of...
On the cultural level, I would say not. There was a great deal of construction in the late 60s in France, and so new buildings were emerging, including in Rennes throughout. You could mark that down as change. And of course, the Faculté des Lettres relocated from the center city Rennes out to the suburbs, you might say, into a new facility. And the departmental archives there in Rennes moved from its very historic, pleasant 19th century building with only one teeny tiny light bulb that dangled from the ceiling, which the directeur would turn off when the sun even appeared to come out. And then we moved that spring into this brand new, I think, 6 or 7 story building with elevators and abundant fluorescent lights. I know this is not of great help to you in your serious inquiries, but yes, if you're talking about social change, I would say far more change in 66, 68 than I saw in the Army at La Rochelle in 63, 64.
And what did you make of the French university system?
I could never understand it from the point of view of the undergraduates. Now, I was matriculated, registered at the Faculté des Lettres, and my only contact there was to attend the occasional class offered by Jean Mayer. I don't know your background in the French history, but he eventually went to the Sorbonne. He was a 17th, 18th century person wrote as many books as Churchill, I think. And we got along well. Not everybody liked Mayer, I think, but I did. And we got along. I attended his seminar once a week, occasionally. But other than that, I didn't go to classes. When I said I didn't understand the point from the undergraduate point of view, where the courses seemed to focus narrowly on not even centuries, but perhaps fragments of centuries. Of the lectures were not what we're used to in America, where you would get some kind of comprehensive treatment of a subject. And my wife took French Lit courses at the Faculté. Now, and her courses were very interesting, but the professor would take one play. The topic was the classicism. The professor would take one play from Racine, and he would go through it, as you know, textual analysis line by line, and it was very revealing. I mean, she would give me the information after the class, but I don't think in the course of the year they even finished one play. And so, and then the students had to go and take a general examination in 17th century French literature. It's assumed they'll do the rest of the reading on their own once they've learned how to do it. I threw up my hands. The students there may have been somewhat more advanced than American students back home, but not that much more advanced. That seemed to me to be graduate level instruction. So that was my opinion then, and I guess it still is as to what it was like in those days. It could be very interesting. I'd love to have taken some of those courses, but as general background, no, I never understood that.
That's quite a common assessment of the university system then, and some would even say now. What was Was there anything particular about Rennes in terms of its position as a city, sort of not that far from Paris, but far enough to be slightly different?
Well, I would say that it was perhaps more than slightly different in Brittany. It's true, of course, that you had all the modern connections. And I calculated once that mail coming from Paris to Rennes traveled at about the same rate as in the 17th century. And that was no lack of respect for the 17th century. They seemed to be able to get the post out there in a couple of days. But yes, I think there was a sense of a Bretonness and a separatism. Now, we were kind of naturally attracted or fell in with students who were taking English, studying English, and there was even a little section of American literature which in Rennes, which was unusual. So it may be that those associations reinforced our sense of separateness, but of course there was in Brittany, but of course there was still a Breton independence movement, very active in the late 60s. I don't know if you know, but in the city center, there was a space, I guess in the town hall, where there was to be a statue of Louis XIV, and then that got to where the Breton separatists would blow it up or steal it or something, and so that space just stood vacant while we were there as a kind of reminder of Breton separatism. And occasionally in shops and so on, people seeing obviously that we were American would make favorable comments about Breton independence, and that drew them into an affiliation with the United Kingdom and with the USA.
Okay, interesting. So how did you start to experience the events of '68 then? How did you become aware that something was happening?
Good question. My wife and I were fortunate in that we'd been able to afford for that second year, 67, 68, a small a black and white television set. We just splurged. I think it cost, I don't remember what it cost. It was enough. We were able to sell it when we left and recovered some of our investment. It was about the size of your computer screen you're looking at now, I imagine. And I don't remember whether they had the deuxième chaîne then or not. It might have been just around the corner. But if not, there was just obviously the one chaîne or channel. And we faithfully watched the news, which came on approximately 7 o'clock. French TV, and maybe throughout Europe, was differently scheduled from the way it is today, in that if programs ran 10 or 15 minutes late, nobody seemed to mind very much. And the news was at 7 to 8, and if it went to 8:30, that was all right too. And so we watched it. It was we would watch it particularly for the coverage of the United States, which was not altogether favorable, or the Vietnam War, but there was stuff about French politics too, of course, and we always watched de Gaulle's press conferences, which we might want to come back to if you haven't heard about those. They were something to mark out on your calendar, research or not, and get there. So it first came up in early May, demonstrations in Paris, and you could tell, I have a modest journalistic background, but you could tell that the French TV, which of course was under government control, if that's not too strong a word, was minimizing the demonstrations and drawing false distinctions between a peaceful demonstration and a more vigorous demonstration, so forth and so on. And these, of course, started with the demonstrations or occupation of buildings at the Sorbonne, if I remember correctly, and then proceeded there from manifestations in the streets and constant marches up to the Arc of Triumph and so on. So that was covered, I would say, minimally on television, but you knew it. And the students in Rennes began to reverberate from those stimuli.
Did you start to get involved then, or did you just observe?
No, I had just turned 30 years of age at that point, and that it never occurred to me to try to get involved. But and the students themselves were slow to organize comparable demonstrations in Rennes. So at first it seemed a Paris thing. I couldn't tell you just when it got to Rennes in a serious way. It might have taken 2 or 3 weeks, and when the public facilities began to to close down, occupations of factories. Happily, the archives in Rennes never shut their doors. So we were always, I know that in Paris the opposite was true, and people would come over on doctoral grants for just enough money for 2 or 3 weeks and be completely shut out of the archives. That's tough, but we didn't have that at Rennes. I worked right straight through.
Okay, so you didn't experience any real disruption to what your activities were?
I wouldn't say that. We experienced disruptions in the sense, I know this makes me sound like a millionaire or something, but we actually had a car as well as a television set. And that comes from both of us being of a certain age, and we'd had some savings and we just invested it in Rennes. And so the gas dried up, as you know. I think that was perhaps the biggest dynamic for the country, is the shutting of the pumps. And so poor me, I filled up my car seeing this coming, and but I didn't want to drive it, because for all I know I'd have to drive it to get out of France. This was late in May. And so poor me, I had to actually walk into the archives, which was about 2 miles. I mean, this was actually good for the santé, one would say today, and I got perfectly used to it. And then later I was able to borrow a bicycle from that Franco-American Institute, and just like a normal person, bicycled into the archives. You had a sense of public facilities beginning to shut down. I mean, the rails are shut down. I was trying to remember if the buses shut down or not. I think they must have, but there was some private entrepreneurial system that did have some bus service between Paris and Rennes, but not, I think, inside the city. Big stores shut down. Banks at first shut down but stayed open, but then reopened. I enormously pleased my landlord by scooping up some money out of our bank account and was able to pay him in advance. He probably expected me to renege on the monthly rent. So yes, it was a drip by drip, not as dramatic as in Paris, but just a steady loss of this or that particular freedom, until at the end. Then I guess I'm something of an alarmist, but I was thinking about 1789 and 1848, and wondering how I'd get out of the not so much about how I'd get out of the country, how I'd get out of the country with all of my research notes. What was going to happen to those? And I actually made inquiries about getting a flight, a little private plane, to the Isle of Jersey, from which you could get to the UK, of course. And some people were doing that, so that would have worked. I could have gotten, but the roads were being cut from time to time by demonstrations. Now, in retrospect, I think when I heard this or that highway up to Saint-Malo had been cut by angry farmers getting into the act, I bet you could have driven up there and say, "Pardon, monsieur, je voudrais traverser, s'il vous plaît." I bet they would have let you right through. But in the environment, it sounded threatening. I apologize for being something of a wimp.
I'm sure you're not the only one. So there was a sense of panic, perhaps, or worry.
Yes, I mean, at the end, I had gotten worried, because I was projecting what's the next step. And for the first 2 or 3 weeks, the next step seemed to be the last step. And then, of course, there gotten to be some violent demonstrations in Paris and clashes with the security police. And I thought we might just be starting to see that in Rennes. I know that some of our 30-year-old people whom we'd gotten to know, they were beginning to get quite alarmed about their apartments. One doctor, very nice fellow, had been concerned about demonstrations passing past his apartment. He was treating people who would come in, but because of the strikes, they'd lost their money, and so he said he couldn't refuse to treat them, but they not only either couldn't pay or would not pay. Somewhat defiantly said, "I'm not going to pay," as though you're in the bourgeoisie. I'm a travailleur, and so you don't get paid. That's that.
Did you manage to get to Paris, or did you stay in Rennes for the whole?
We stayed in Rennes. I mean, you could hardly get to Paris, at least not the way we were accustomed on the regular train. But I mentioned to David, or maybe I put in one of my emails, that Don Sutherland showed up, and we had gotten to know him, and he was thrilled. I hope you get to talk to him if you've not already. He thought this was May 1789. He was more pleased. By this time, I had soured on the whole thing, and I told him this meant that Richard Nixon was going to get elected president of the United States in November, which, of course, is exactly what happened. And so Don went off, and I don't think he had any trouble moving about, but I believe he did be a little less enamored of 1968 as the weeks wore on. And then we had friends from England, a fellow I knew in graduate school. He and his wife were coming in a big VW van. You remember those things or seen them? And we had made arrangements, and I'd assumed that because I thought maybe the Channel Ferries had terminated, he wouldn't make it. But our little doorbell rang at the appointed time, and to my surprise, there he was in his with his wife in his big van. And we immediately, he thought I was being too alarmist. I wasn't too happy to see him because I wasn't sure he was going to be able to get out. So we went and filled up his van with gas. He thought that was an excessive precaution. But when he did leave, he was headed to Switzerland. You know, I told him, you know, whenever you see a gas station open, take it, even if you just need a gallon. But he didn't see any gas stations open on the way to Switzerland. And but he made it just barely. You know, he came down to 30 or 40 miles an hour to save gas, and wrote me later he was concerned at the end, but he slipped into Geneva, and so all was well. But those were the kinds of things you experienced. Okay,
so just some reflections on some of the dominant characteristics of 68. So this period is often presented as one that saw people talking to each other a lot more than had been the case beforehand, this famous prise de parole. Is that something that you experienced?
Well, yeah, I suppose you would say so, in that people whom we already knew could talk of a little else except the événement. I think most of our people were concerned about it, if not outright against it, though they were guarded in their what they said about their political opinions. And I assume that was just characteristic of the French, or maybe characteristic of them with the foreigners. Yes, it was. But I don't think if you're trying to decide if there's any talk about how we, the bourgeoisie, should look kindly upon workers' strikes, I don't think so. Though I know that not everyone was harsh and oppressive. And yeah, I'll back up. I think many felt there was some justification for the workers. Maybe none for the students so much, but some sympathy there.
Picking up on that, another thing that's often discussed is the attempt, perhaps, to bring about some sort of unity between the students and the workers. Did you get a sense that there was an attempt, or did that work, or did it not work?
In Rennes, I couldn't tell you. On the television, we saw plenty of evidence of that from the demonstrations, and I know you've come up with the name of Daniel Cohn-Bendit and his efforts in that regard to undercut the traditional union leadership, which he apparently effectively did. French TV continued to function, and we should have come back to that. You know, the French television personnel themselves joined the strike, and there was have you heard of the name Léon Zitron? Has he come up in any of your previous interviews? He was the avuncular anchorman of that 7 o'clock news I was talking about. He reminded you of Walter Cronkite, but you probably don't know Walter Cronkite either. Zitron, Léon, Z-I-T-R-O-N-E. So he was a person of, as I said, avuncular, of some gravitas, of essential fairness, I would say. I mean, I was against the Vietnam War, but I thought sometimes French TV went a little too far. Maybe that's just my American bias. But Léon Zitron was always, you couldn't really quarrel with him. And in the end, he, as I said, he well-known fellow, I believe an author of a book or two, but joined the strike and was never allowed to come back on television. I don't know what happened to him. So the French TV news changed character dramatically as the strike went on. You could tell they were dealing with the second stringers and third stringers, and the camera work got poorer. But the They continued to cover the demonstrations, and there you saw the evidence of student-worker alliances are trying to join together.
Okay, another interesting area is that, which you've already touched on, which is related to the question of violence. Do you consider the 1968 to have been a violent revolt?
Well, it was getting very close, at least it seemed to me. In Paris, as we said before, there was fighting between students, workers, and that CRS, the Republican security people, some of whom, according to rumor, were former German soldiers, if not outright Nazis, but they were people you knew not to trifle with, as opposed to the friendly, or maybe not friendly, gendarme directing traffic. There was no violence that I recall in Rennes. You never had the sense that you couldn't walk the streets. If a demonstration was in progress, I wouldn't have been concerned about my personal safety. But I don't think you really knew what the police would do if something happened. You know, the grocery stores closed, at least maybe not the mom and pops, but the bigger ones, and the government put out the information that if a food shortages developed, they would open up their emergency World War III store of rations. Having been in the Army myself, I wasn't altogether confident that this did not make me feel any better to think that we would be going to K rations or something like that and standing in long lines. But I'm getting away from your question, of course, which was something about, I didn't have any sense of real violence in Rennes, but the faculty at the university shut down. Of course, Jean Mayer advised his students not to faire la grève, but that seminar never met again, unfortunately.
Okay, just to pick up on another point that you mentioned earlier, obviously perspectives on 1968 are dominated by Paris. Someone who was outside of Paris, did you see this as a national revolt, or was there a separation between what was happening in Paris and elsewhere? Or
well, that's a good question. My impression, purely from television, is that there wasn't much connection, except towards the end, Daniel Cohn-Bendit fled to Germany, I believe, and maybe he came back. Or I don't remember that well. I believe that some of the German students were interested in picking up the banner, but frankly, I don't remember that. And in Rennes, not at all. From my experience, now, if you were to talk to someone who was in the student dormitories at Rennes, you'd probably get a totally different picture.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the different perspectives. As an international, I nearly said student, but you weren't quite right. You were a student. As someone from outside of France, do you think that characterized your experience of 1968? Did it make it more difficult to be in France because you were an international student?
No, I never felt that. Of course, my wife and I were comfortable in France. We didn't feel exactly like foreigners. We had been there by that time a year and a half. And in fact, I met my wife when I was in the Army before at La Rochelle. She was a school teacher. And then before that, she had a study abroad program. So we both had years in France. Her French, by the way, was always much better than mine. She got a number of comments, and I was pleased when they pretended to be able to understand me. But so, no, I didn't have a sense of alienation. But besides that, we've been studying French literature, French history. I mean, it came to seem like close to a second home at that point.
Was there any sense that what was happening was part of a more international wave of protest? Because happening elsewhere.
I really can't. I don't remember anything about that. I would say possibly not by the time it ended in late May, early June, which came with that was as much of a surprise as the way it began.
I'll ask you a question about that in a second, but before I do, what was your impression of how the political elite handled the events of '68?
My impression is they panicked and had no answer, no remedy. anything that was going on. As you know, de Gaulle was in Romania on some mission that he claimed was of world historical importance and refused to return, but he did return, though it kind of made you feel better, I guess, if you were starting to get worried to see pictures of him getting off at the airport, but it made no difference whatsoever. He seemed irrelevant. Now, the mayor of Rennes was also a député to the National Assembly with the Conservative Party. That was Henri Fréville. And he ended up voting, I believe, a no confidence, taking part in the no confidence vote against the Prime Minister Pompidou. And he said to Maillère, who knew Fréville and related to me, that Fréville took that vote, which cost him his political career. He took that vote because he had been over to, if not to the Élysée, somewhere in the government, and just sensed that the ministers were running around knowing not what to do, in a panic themselves, with a sense of everything slipping away. And so that was unsettling as well.
What did you think of the opposition politicians, Mitterrand, Mendes France?
Gee, I don't remember. I was hoping that, I don't think the opposition politicians did very much either. It seemed as though it was Cohn-Bendit and the students were trying to crack the whip. I mean, to some degree, I couldn't say that I'd be taking sides in a French political disagreement. I was just hoping to get back to normal so that you could move about. I mean, the electricity people struck, but we kept the power stayed on throughout the. That was a side comment. So yeah, I don't have any sense that the opposition political people, who'd been pretty thoroughly oppressed by then, in a sense, had very much influence or purchase either.
Okay, so how did you feel when the events were finally brought to a conclusion and we started to get back to normal?
Yes, I remember quite well. They were brought to a conclusion by de Gaulle's famous speech in late May. I didn't try to break out a timeline. I'm sure you know the background, that he recorded the speech and then went off to Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, and the speech was then not telecast, but broadcast, the voice only. And I have forgotten where I was when I heard it. I might have been at the archives, or maybe I was at home. You know, memories do get mixed up together. But I can quote to you verbatim from some of it, having heard it only the once. It was very firm. You know, at first he'd come on with a conciliatory address about how workers needed to be involved in councils in their factories, and students the same way in the faculté. But this time he was much firmer. Someone said later he had gotten on his boots of 1940. And he spoke, how did it go? He said, Pompidou was under attack, as he said, je ne changerai pas le Premier Ministre. And he said this in the crispest, the most definitive way. Je ne changerai pas le Premier. Oh, no, he started out, je ne me démissionnerai pas. If my French is still bad, I shall not resign. Je ne changerai pas le Premier Ministre, dont la valeur, I believe le courage, etc., mérite l'hommage de tous. Je dissous aujourd'hui l'Assemblée nationale. And I call for elections so that the Français peuvent s'exprimer, moins que les démonstrateurs n'entendent pas, empêcher les Français de s'exprimer comme ils empêchent les étudiants d'étudier et les travailleurs de travailler. You know, de Gaulle was a literary fellow, as you know. And so that sense of someone in charge at last, and also the prospect of a national vote, which I think came at exactly the right time. I don't think the national vote would have had exactly the same impact if it had even come even a week earlier. I think people were ready for a way out, and voting seemed to be as good a way, the best way of all. And of course, the army had to promise that although it would not intervene against the demonstrators, it would guarantee the safety of the election. And at that point, I think it just seemed the air went out of the balloon. They had negotiated, the government had negotiated with the operators of gasoline stations, and they came back to work. I believe they may have been the first. And so everybody went to fill up, except me. I was still sitting on my hoard of a full tank of gas in my Volkswagen Beetle. But then you began to recover movement and the freedoms that had been lost. Everybody went to the election, and you know about that.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Can you remember how your friends back home or your peers back home felt about you being in France while this was going on?
I don't think anyone was particularly worried. I think they thought, I don't know how much coverage it got in the United States. I don't recall that my parents or my wife's parents or anyone at the graduate school ever having expressed the slightest concern for me. I guess they figured we would get out if we needed to, one way or another. Oh, as I said, I'm a bit of an alarmist. At one point, I went down and I managed to telephone at the PTT to the American Embassy to ask if there were any kind of evacuation orders or evacuation warnings. And I know that sounds extreme, but the person I talked to was an American, said, we're monitoring the situation and not yet, stay tuned, there might be something. So although as I said, that was premature, and I feel a little embarrassed about confessing it. I wasn't the only one who was wondering, what was going to happen next week.
And did you stay on in France after?
Oh, yes. After it, well, I had my research notes to get out. And we went back on schedule. We went back in July and spent a little time in Paris before we left. I can tell you that we stayed in hotels, of course. And the hotel people in the tourists, they were not happy at all because this had cost them, a good deal of income, and restaurant people a good deal of revenue. So the aftermath was that it was a fine time to be traveling a tourist, because you would get special treatment. You'd never have trouble getting into a restaurant, and they might give you some extras as a way of gratitude. And then we stayed in a pension that we come to know in Paris for a couple of weeks before we left, and it was practically empty, and the proprietor was really in a bad mood because he had the big summer. That's where he made all his money, of course. And now all of those reservations had been canceled.
Well, that's interesting. I've never heard that before. So you stayed in Paris for the June-July period, and it was...
Yes, we stayed there for 2 weeks in July. We left Rennes at some point in June, and I think we went down into the Dordogne as a final farewell. And there we had the same reaction with people, with the people in the tourist, how much suffering, how they were taking it on the chin. And then we had to take the car up to Le Havre to put it on the boat, and then back to Paris, where again people were feeling sorry for themselves with good reason about the loss of income they were facing. Yeah, quite a few people lost out in the demonstrations.
Speaking of consequences, I mean, how did you perceive the short-term consequences, and how do you perceive today the long-term consequences of these events?
That's a good question. The short-term consequences, of course, were of the sweeping victory of the Gaullist party, Pompidou taking the lead. He campaigned aggressively against what he called the communisme totalitaire. And there were communist demonstrations active in Rennes. Though I remember when there was an art history professor, he led a tour that my wife and I attended of old buildings, les vieux bâtiments, just a week or two before the demonstration started. And sure enough, I saw him on TV addressing a communist group in no uncertain way a week or two later on the television. But yeah, of course, campaigning against communisme totalitaire was a bit of a stretch, even for Pompidou. But the result was the overwhelming conservative majority. And poor Monsieur Fréville lost his job to an unqualified or underqualified man whom I can't remember the name of the Gaullist party at this moment. They recruited a school teacher, just of no particular standing, a youngish man in his 30s, probably seemed to have no idea about public events, but he was for de Gaulle and Pompidou and against Fréville, and that won him the election. So the short-term consequences were that, and a semi-return to normality, if that's a word. I think the long-term consequences are pretty obvious. I don't know that the universities ever completely recovered. And maybe this is just, I became more conservative after that. I would have called myself a liberal pre-1968. It took a year or two, but I moved towards the center. This had to do as much with American politics as anything, over more to somewhere on the right. Well, I don't think of the right in today's terms. You have to remember an earlier period. And from that perspective, I don't think the universities were any healthier because of what they went through. I think it encouraged the onset of student grievances and perhaps altered the curriculum, but though I don't know. And then, of course, France since that time has suffered one major strike after another. I don't know if there's a causal link there, but it doesn't seem altogether healthy to me. I said I was going to talk about strikes pre-1968. If you've heard this one, just stop me. But in the Army, we used to make fun of France in front of our French employees in a good-natured way, because pre-1968 striking was permitted. That may seem a silly way to put it, but strikes had to be announced in advance. And I think maybe it was a week or two in advance. And they could only last 24 hours or 48 hours, and that was negotiable. Maybe it would come down to 12 hours. And so we would joke, my Army colleagues and I, with the French, boy, in America, this is the time of big airline strikes. In America, we shut the whole thing down. It stays down. Here in France, you just have wimpy little strikes, and you hardly notice them sometimes. They might just be a few hours. Or you'd have to go out and fill up your car before the gasoline people will go out for that one day if you're running low. Yeah, so that was a bit extreme, one might say. But since then, as you well know, you go to France, you better check the headlines to see if you're going to have the metro, the trains, whatever. And I have to say, I don't think that's a good thing.
I mean, I'm assuming here that you've maintained quite a strong contact with France ever since that period.
Oh, sure.
I wondered if you have perceived any more general consequences of 1968, perhaps at a more societal, cultural level.
I don't know that I could go beyond what I've said. Of course, 68 is well in the background, and so I continue to go back to France for research trips and longer stays for sabbatical or study abroad. So yes, I've maintained quite a bit of contact over the years. I guess now that I think of it, when I would go back to the Sorbonne and visit Maillard or attend defense of a doctoral dissertation, I have to admit I couldn't really have told you this was post-68 or pre-68, so perhaps I exaggerated a bit earlier. But I'll give you one example of what I would call a permissive attitude towards strikes. When my wife and I were in Paris maybe 10 years ago, and we lived up in the Latin Quarter or somewhere, and out of my apartment window where there was a place where all the streets come together, Carrefour, where 4 or 5 streets, big streets, came together, and a small group of demonstrators took control of the rond-point, the intersection, with drums and megaphones and one thing and another, and therefore shut down this nexus of traffic, which surprised me. I hadn't expected to see that before. And then sure enough, here came the cops. So I called my wife to come to the window. Now I knew they weren't coming with their truncheons, and that they would. And I expected negotiation and politesse, but no, the police circled the demonstrators in order to protect them. And so they stayed there as long as they liked, which wasn't terribly long, but it was enough to mess up your commute. And then another time, there's the Festival du Livre, Fête du Livre, and you've been there, I presume, March, I believe, and I love it. I went out there the last time in the early 2000s, and there was a group out there demonstrating against FNP, FEMAC, or whatever it is, which had nothing to do with the book thing. But they made a lot of racket so that you couldn't pick up the books and browse easily. and that just went on as long as they wanted to. Nobody came to shoo them away. So I guess that is a long-term consequence of 1968.
That's interesting. Do you think that these events changed, shaped, or inflected your understanding of France?
Well, as I indicated before, it made me more sympathetic to people who didn't much like the French Revolution. I have to admit, and I think Don Sutherland might tell you the same thing. If I had to place myself in the French Revolution, I would be with the people on June 20th, the tennis court oath, and the constitutional monarchy. And after that, I don't have much use for the people who brought down the king, let alone the terrorist. And I don't mean that in my lectures I did teach French Revolution. I would take out after Robespierre, but I said, this is, he had his good points, I suppose. But, it wasn't Edmund Burke interpretation, in other words. Of course, Burke didn't have any use for the constitutional monarchy. But I tended to see the other side a little bit more in my teaching. That would be the biggest difference. And my mentor, George Taylor, I don't think ever moved. We had a couple of conversations, and he seemed to agree with me a little bit, but then he reverted right back to type. He was the revolution as a block. Sure, the monarchy, constitutional monarchy is good, but the terror had to be there to institute democracy.
Very good. You've mentioned this beforehand, but if you could just develop it a little bit, what impact do you think 1968 had on you personally, stroke politically?
Well, personally, it may be, and this would be true of events in America as well, and it's true of me today, perpetually allergic to even the whiff of a political violence in the streets in Paris, London, Berlin, in America. And of course, as you know, we're concerned about that in this election cycle. You probably didn't know that just this morning, the news brought word that a Republican headquarters in a small town in North Carolina had been firebombed overnight, and anti-Nazi slogans written on it. And there's been stuff the pro-Trump forces, the anti-Trump forces, same thing. I think it's still confined to a very small minority, and I'm not losing any sleep over it. But that's the effect that it had on me, is to value political discourse, political civility, and at the end of the day, what I would still think of as the British-American political tradition to which the French try to adhere as best they can, and good luck to them with it.
Did your experience of 1968 affect your scholarship on France?
No, I couldn't say that. I've been back in the 17th century with Louis XIV, and I don't believe I don't believe there's been any effect there. I didn't deal with the topics that would particularly lend themselves to any kind of a political viewpoint. So I would have to decline that. In the teaching of the French Revolution course, yes, or maybe more broadly speaking, in teaching what we have a Western civilization course. I don't know if you have that in Britain. I don't believe you did years ago. That goes, from Plato to NATO, as we used to say. And as I would teach that, I would occasionally make side comments questioning mob violence or the use of troops on the other side. When the French did in 1848 or 1789, so that's always a bad sign when armies have to be deployed in the streets to keep order. And of course, back in the Nixon years here, there was what is reported to have been a near takeover by demonstrators of the Nixon White House, and they themselves pulled back, as I recall reading. But it wasn't clear, such was the decomposition in our country then, that the soldiers, of whom there were few, would have been able to defend the White House, or would even have been willing. Well, they were getting off track, but that would have it was probably more the events in America in the early 70s that have pushed me in that direction intellectually and in my teaching than in France. But certainly 1968 in France had had an influence.
And what did you do when you get back to the States in the summer?
Well, I went back to North Carolina and wrote my dissertation, finished that, and then came and taught for 45 years at the University of Delaware, which is near where I live now in Westchester, Pennsylvania.
And when you returned back to the United States after having experienced what had happened in France, did you bring any of those ideas with you? Did you feel as though it had changed your perspective on how things played out in the States afterwards, or was it just separate?
Well, no, I think my opinions stayed the same. I'm leery of student demonstrations that go beyond a certain point, or student politicization of courses or of the faculty. Delaware was relatively peaceful in the early 70s, where, some institutions at one point, something like 73 or so, weren't sure they're going to be able to reopen. I believe Columbia was in particularly a hotbed. I know it was a hotbed. Horace Ranum, 17th century French great man, had some trouble there. Yes, so I think the two blended in together. Finally, we got back to something like normal.
Okay, so as someone who has maintained an interest, I've got the sun in my eyes,
Okay.
An interest in France and having experienced 1968, I would assume that you've watched on with some interest how the story of this period has been told over the years and how that has changed or developed or not. And I wondered if you had a perspective on whether or not the way the events are commonly portrayed in France or abroad accurately captures your experience of it.
I have to admit that I'm unfamiliar with recent work in the area. I think it's perceived more or less favorably. And perhaps if I added one thing against the other, I would say the consequences have had some positive consequences too. Certainly, as I indicated earlier, the oppression particularly of unorganized workers would be a source of concern for me then and now. But as to how it's currently perceived, all I can say on that subject is that I believe I spoke to Don Sutherland about this. I said this will someday be an object of a study, and we should take notes and conduct diaries and make contacts, but I don't believe he ever did, and I had enough to do that I couldn't get back to it either. I have a very small library on the subject, but haven't really been back into it since 68 and 69.
Okay. Well, that's what people like me are trying to do. So I'm going to ask you one more thing. So I've asked everybody who I have interviewed thus far to rise to the challenge of being able to summarize how they perceive these events in 30 seconds.
Okay, I guess the clock is starting now. Well, I would say that the events demonstrated the fragility, the unexpected fragility of the French government structure as created by de Gaulle, which had seemed perfectly stable up to that point. And I think no one even had a hint of this coming. I think that's the main. And I would say the second would be the volatility of the political volatility of the universities, which had not been detected hitherto either. And perhaps third would be my personal sense of how easy it is for the things we take for granted in society, how easily for them to slip away point by point until you wonder, what kind of country you're living in at some point. Okay. 3 points, that might be enough.
3 points is great. That's great.